Since it achieved statehood in 1959, Alaska has been one of the hardest states to win in. Many in political circles are well connected, and those connections lead to the preservation of the political system. This is why former Congressman Don Young was the sixth longest serving member of the House of Representatives, and Ted Stevens was the 11th longest serving senator. But even though those political circles might be small and well connected, the geographical landscape is vast, usually requiring bush flights to ferry politicians from event to event. These flights, along with the harsh weather conditions of the last frontier, has led to the deaths of a number of high-profile politicians. Yes, sometimes the maverick pulls off the upset, but usually the entrenched political establishment survives. In today's video, we are going to talk about the short yet very interesting electoral history of the state of Alaska. Hello everyone, my name is Dave and welcome to Election History. I have a master's degree in political science from McGill University focusing on voting behavior, and I do videos about campaigns, elections, political parties, candidates, and the likes. If this is the type of content that you like, please subscribe to the channel. We are close to hitting 20,000 subscribers, and it would be great if we could hit that goal on the first day that this video is dropped. Also, if you would like to support the channel financially, you can become a member on Patreon. Each one of these videos can take anywhere from 30 to 40 hours to make, and I'm the only one making these videos. I also add other videos that are only available for Patreon members. Memberships start off at $3 a month, so if you would like to help out, it would be greatly appreciated. Now, let's talk about Alaska. Alaska's entry into the Union of the United States of America wasn't necessarily some sort of patriotic act and desire to become Americans, but to increase autonomy regarding issues important to the economy. Prior to statehood, the territory of Alaska was almost entirely dependent on the federal government, with a large portion of the territory's population being U.S. military personnel. But it even went beyond the military, as permission to use any land for the purposes of mining, timber, and even the waters for fishing were controlled by the federal government. What made it even worse was that if a company wanted to extract resources from Alaska, they didn't lobby the Alaskan government, but instead the federal government, in which Alaska had no representation. And conversely, if the interests in Alaska wanted to change something in Alaska, they would have to go to Washington, D.C. and lobby the federal government. Furthermore, if there were any deals to be struck, it was the federal government that reaped all the benefits, not the people of Alaska. But once statehood was granted, many of the issues that were previously federally controlled were now controlled by the new government in Juneau, with lobbyists and newly elected legislators meeting at the Barone Hotel cocktail lounge. If you are involved with Alaska politics, please let me know if this is still a place where they meet, as the hotel still exists. This meant that the early political and electoral history of Alaska didn't fall along partisan lines. They didn't even really fall within ideological spheres. Instead, in the state of Alaska's early days, voters were more likely to elect a person who they thought had Alaska's interest at heart and rarely looked at the national issues. And to be fair, Alaska is still somewhat that way today. Immediately after statehood, the Democrats were the dominant party. There are some theories as to why the Democrats dominated early in the state's history. One theory is that many of those who moved to Alaska in the 1950s and the 1960s were from the American South, and that they just kept their partisan alliances. This kind of makes sense since George Wallace won 12% of the vote in Alaska in 1968, with it being his seventh best non-southern state. But this is mostly just a theory, but an interesting one nonetheless. Also, because Alaska was a new state, it didn't have strong party organizations. According to Frank Jonas in his book Politics in the American West, he stated that in the early days, political parties didn't even have a staff or a headquarters, thus partisan labels were simply just that, labels. One of the reasons for the lack of organization was that it was extremely difficult to travel between populations. It was difficult for either party officials or those running for governor to just jump into a car and drive to their next campaign destination. Instead, politicians usually used bush pilots to take them from event to event, even in the worst of weather conditions. These bush flights would have a big impact on Alaskan politics, both positively and negatively. Finally, Jonas argues in these early days of voting, voters were more likely to be independent minded, again, something that is still true today. Additionally, since the state hadn't built up a strong political base yet, personalities were more likely to drive vote choice than partisanship or issues, since many of the candidates had similar views on the issues. The first elections for U.S. Senate, House, and state executive and legislative offices were held on November 25, 1958. The Democrats swept all of the statewide offices and won both the Alaska House and Senate, with the first Senate president being Bill Belts, the first Alaskan Inuit to lead a legislative state chamber. Unfortunately, Belts would die 2 years later of a malignant brain tumor. The person elected to governor that year was William Egan, who defeated businessman John Butrovich in the general election, winning 59.6% of the vote. Egan was highly involved with Alaska's move to statehood, being considered one of the founding fathers of the state of Alaska. During his first term as governor, his main focus was simply on good governance and making sure that Alaska had a smooth transition from territory to statehood. Another founding father of Alaska's statehood was Bob Bartlett, a Democrat who had now been elected to the U.S. Senate. Bartlett previously served as Secretary of the Alaska Territory, appointed by President Franklin Roosevelt from 1939 to 1944, and then Alaska's delegate to Congress from 1945 until 1959, when he finally assumed his new role as U.S. Senator. At this time, Bartlett was probably the most known as well as the most liked politician in Alaska, winning his U.S. Senate race with 83.3% of the votes against Republican R.E. Robinson. As with Egan, he was a high-profile politician fighting for Alaskan statehood. But, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Alaska was still dependent on federal government contracts even after statehood was achieved. With Bartlett's connections in both Alaska and Washington, D.C., he was able to bring funds to Alaska to build a number of public works projects. Since both senators were elected at the same time, Bartlett was considered Alaska's senior senator on account of his time served as Alaska's delegate to Congress. However, fellow Senator Ernest Gruening objected to this. A coin toss was actually used to determine who would be designated the senior senator. Bartlett won and was now the state's senior senator. This brings us to Ernest Gruening, who was Alaska's other senator. Prior to being elected senator, Gruening served as both the governor of the Territory of Alaska from 1939 to 1953, as well as the shadow senator from 1956 to 1959, when he became the state's actual senator. Gruening was focused more on federal issues than Bartlett or newly elected Congressman Ralph Rivers. Gruening was also not afraid to speak his mind and voted very much as an independent in U.S. Senate, even if it went against his own party. In 1960, Senator Bartlett won election to his full term, winning 63.4% of the vote over Republican Lee McKinney, with Congressman Ralph Rivers also being elected, but with 56.8% of the votes. Most notable in 1960 was Richard Nixon winning the presidential election against John F. Kennedy in Alaska. Since Alaska was a strong Democratic state at that time, many expected Kennedy to win Alaska easily. But Nixon, who visited Alaska as part of his 50-state strategy, won the state, with many Alaskans seeing him as being more concerned about the state's issues rather than Kennedy. At least that is what we are told, but people forget that Kennedy also visited Alaska. Remember, at this time, partisan leanings were soft, and Democrats mainly were in control of most of the offices because the people holding those offices had been highly involved with Alaskan politics before statehood. In 1962, Governor Egan won re-election in a tough battle against Mike Stepovich, the last territorial governor of the state. Ralph Rivers was also re-elected with 56% of the vote. Senator Gruening was elected to his full term in the U.S. Senate, winning 58% of the votes against Republican and U.S. Attorney Ted Stevens, who would be elected to the Alaska House of Representatives 2 years later. But politics were about to go through a change in Alaska. First, let's look at the Democratic Party. In many one-party states, like Alaska was at the time, political divisions within the party started to form. Some of these divisions were personal, some were those who were opposed or supported Governor Egan, which was more of an old guard versus new guard thing, while others were based on liberal and conservative ideology. This last one played a very important role in the early 1960s. In 1961, Democratic Party Chairman John S. Hellenthal was stripped of much of his power within the Democratic Party because of his stance on unemployment compensation. But included in this new liberal conservative cleavage was the issue of the environment. During the mid 1960s, the issue of the environment was becoming more salient, especially in a state like Alaska, where mining, timbering, and overfishing were becoming a problem. But it wasn't just the environmental impact that was a problem, but also the financial impact. One of those projects was the Rampart Dam, a federally funded project that would have created a hydroelectric dam north of Fairbanks. Of course, the environmentalists opposed it since they felt that it hurt the environment. However, others opposed it because they felt that it was a waste of government spending, calling it a make-work project. Still, others opposed it because they felt that the businesses using the resources would be the only benefactors. And even with all these objections, all of Alaska's DC delegation supported the project as well as most Alaskans. But in 1967, Interior Secretary Mo Udall pulled the plug on the project, with many Alaskans seeing this as another issue regarding federal involvement in what they wanted in the state, even though this was an Army Corps of Engineers project. This battle between the federal and state government, as well as the battle between pro-development and pro-environmental forces, continue to this day. Not much happened in the 1964 election. Neither the governorship nor the U.S. Senate seats were up for re-election. President Lyndon Johnson won the state with 65.9% of the votes, making it his 10th strongest state. Ralph Rivers won re-election to the House, but with only 51.5% of the vote, beating Lowell Thomas Jr. Another thing of note in 1964 was that Senator Goering was one of only 2 senators who voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, putting him at odds with both the Democratic Party and Lyndon Johnson. The next 6 years in Alaska politics were to become the most consequential years in the state's political history. First, let's start off with the 1966 election. In the state, the economy was starting to stagnate, as the state's economy was still highly connected to the federal government. Also, while the Democrats continued infighting in their party, the Republicans were working hard to build theirs. In the 1966 election for governor, Governor Egan lost to hotel owner and Republican Wally Hickel by only 1,080 votes. Incumbent Congressman Ralph Rivers also lost to Republican challenger Howard Wallace Pollock. Frank Jonas states that the reason Pollock won was because he took bush flights around Alaska and met voters in remote villages, while Rivers didn't really campaign and mostly stayed in Washington. Bob Bartlett, still a popular senator, won re-election with 75.5% of the vote. The next year, in 1967, oil and natural gas was discovered in Prudhoe Bay in the North Slope of Alaska. While companies were ready to start drilling and putting a pipeline down to the south in Valdez to get the oil out to market, there was a dispute by many indigenous nations claiming ancestral rights to the land. This led to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which, in return for allowing drilling, gave indigenous nations nearly 150 million acres of federal land and $1 billion. Drilling started soon afterward. In 1968, Senator Gruening would be challenged in the Democratic Party primary by Alaska House of Representative member Mike Gravel. Of course, Gravel, being only 38 at the time, was part of the Democratic Party that urged for a change away from the old guard. He also ran a modern campaign using radio and television in a way that hadn't been used in Alaska before. He even made a small biographical movie to get voters to know him more. Interestingly, while many people think of Gravel nowadays as being a strong opponent of the Iraq War, he was neutral on the Vietnam War, winning pro-war Democrats in the primary. Remember, Gruening voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and was staunchly against the war. Gravel would go on to win the Democratic primary with 52.9% of the vote. In another iconic flip, considering most people know Gravel for being an anti Iraq war person, younger voters and supporters of Eugene McCarthy's movement were able to get Senator Gruening on the ballot as a write in candidate as an anti war candidate. Gravel would go on to win the general election with 45.1% of the vote, with Gruening winning 17.4% of the vote as a write-in. In the race for Alaska's at-large congressional seats, Howard Wallace Pollock won yet again with 54.2% of the vote, defeating Democratic State Senator Nick Begich. Just 1 month after the election, Senator Bartlett passed away. With Governor Wally Hickel being a Republican, he appointed the Republican majority leader in the Alaska House of Representatives as Bartlett's temporary successor. That man was Ted Stevens. Now, for many of you watching this video, you might already know this, but spoiler alert, Stevens would serve in this position for the next 40 years. This meant that there would be a special election for the U.S. Senate in 1970, along with the race for governor and, of course, the congressional seat up every 2 years. First, let's look at the race for governor. Former Governor Bill Egan ran against current Governor Keith Miller. You might be asking yourself where Wally Hickel went. Well, Hickel was appointed as Secretary of the Interior in 1969, which led to the Alaskan Secretary of State, Keith Miller, being elevated to governor. But Miller had a primary challenge from Congressman Howard Wallace Pollock. Miller beat Pollock in the Republican primary, ending Pollock's political career. Miller, in turn, lost to Egan, thus ending Miller's political career. In the congressional race, Pollock wasn't running for re-election, obviously because he was running for governor. This led to Anchorage banker Frank Murkowski being the Republican nominee. He would run against Nick Begich, who, like in the previous election, would travel the state on bush flights to reach out to voters. As for Murkowski, he saw the race more as a fundraising effort, feeling that radio and television were the way to go, especially since it worked so effectively for Senator Gravel 2 years earlier. Begich would win, receiving 55.1% of the vote to Murkowski's 44.9%. Finally, let's look at the U.S. Senate race. Of course, Stevens ran for the position and was considered the frontrunner. Other candidates running against Stevens was Democrat Joe Josephson, Republican Fitz Singer, and former Democratic Speaker of the House during the territorial era, Wendell P. Kay. It should be also noted here that Alaska had a blanket primary system, meaning that all the candidates, regardless of party, are on the first primary ballot. However, only the top candidates for each party make it to the general election. Both Stevens and Kay easily won their party's nomination. By this time, Stevens had a strong reputation in the state, while Kay was seen as part of the old guard. Even though Egan and Begich won, Stevens beat Kay, winning 59.6% of the vote, a landslide that most had not anticipated. The 1972 elections were not expected to be anything special. Incumbent President Richard Nixon was expected to win Alaska's 3 electoral votes. He did win, but ultra-conservative Congressman John Smits, who was running under the American Independent Party, this was the remnants of the party George Wallace formed 4 years earlier, won 7.25% of the votes, making this his second strongest state. In the U.S. Senate race, Ted Stevens won a full term to the U.S. Senate, winning 77.3% of the vote. In the congressional race, incumbent Mark Begich was expected to win easily. But a few weeks earlier, on October 16th, while traveling on a bush flight from Anchorage to Juneau with Democratic Majority Leader Hale Boggs of Louisiana, the plane went missing and has still never been found. Begich would go on to beat his Republican opponent, State Senator Don Young, even though he passed away weeks earlier. If you want to see another video about a man who died in a plane crash and actually beat an incumbent senator, you can check out this video about the 2000 U.S. Senate race in Missouri. The problem after the election was that Begich was only missing and not technically declared dead. Therefore, the state had to bring the matter to court to declare his seat vacant. The courts agreed and a special election was called. Don Young was the Republican candidate, while the Democrats nominated engineer and Alaska Democratic Party chairman Amel Nati, after a contentious state convention battle. Young would go on to win with 51.4% of the vote to Noddy's 48.6% of the votes. Spoiler alert, Young would serve in this seat until his death in 2022. Since Young continued until his death in 2022, I just want to talk about him here. Throughout most of his political life, Young was easily able to win re-election. He had a close election in 1990, winning only by 3.9%, and in 1992, winning by 4%. Otherwise, he easily won re-election. Like Senator Gruning, Young was a maverick and said what he thought. He was socially conservative, but much more moderate on economic issues than most congressional Republicans, and had no problem working with Democrats. With that, we'll come back to the congressional seat in 2022. So, Begich, Stevens, Young, Murkowski, you might see why I say that these few years were probably the most consequential years in Alaska politics, as all of these men, including some of their sons and daughters and grandsons, would go on to have successful political careers in Alaska. By the time the 1974 election rolled around, Senator Mike Gravel had become even more outspoken and eccentric than the senator he replaced 6 years earlier. Instead of ignoring the Vietnam War issue, he was now staunchly anti-war and against the expansion of defense spending. During the 1972 Democratic Convention, he nominated himself for vice president and even won 226 delegates. However, he was still a supporter of economic development in Alaska. One thing that had been held up was the proposed Trans-Alaskan pipeline. Because the pipeline would go through federal and indigenous lands, it needed to be approved by Congress. Once the Department of Interior, remember headed by former Alaska Governor Wally Hickel, lifted any restrictions, the preliminary planning and building for the pipeline started. Because of his strong stance on the pipeline, Gravel easily won re-election with 58.3% of the vote. By the time the 1974 election came around, Wally Hickel was back in Alaska and running for governor yet again. This race for governor was interesting because it had one incumbent governor, that being Bill Egan, and two former Republican governors, Wally Hickel and Keith Miller, the man who replaced Hickel when he became the Interior Secretary. But there was another candidate, Jay Hammond, who was the state Senate president, World War II veteran, and Bush pilot. Hammond was pro-development, like the current and former governors running. However, Hammond opposed companies coming into the state and simply taking resources without any cost. He felt that these companies should be paying higher taxes for the privilege of extracting natural resources. His opponents disagreed. Hammond finished first among Republicans in the primary election, with Egan finishing first amongst Democrats. Hammond would go on to win the general election by 287 votes, which led to a recount in which Hammond won. Once governor, Hammond pushed through a constitutional amendment which established the Alaska Permanent Fund, a wealth fund created by taxing oil money. The program still runs today. There were no major elections in 1976, with Gerald Ford winning 57.9% of the vote over Jimmy Carter in the state of Alaska. In 1978, there was a Wild West-style election, with former Governor Wally Hickel, who had lost to incumbent Republican Governor Jay Hammond in the primary, becoming an independent write-in candidate in the general election. There was also a Democratic candidate, Chauncey Croft, another independent, Tom Kelly, and Don Wright, the candidate of the Alaska Independence Party, which I will talk about later. Hammond, benefiting from the economic boon from the state's oil money, won with 39% of the votes, with all candidates but Wright receiving double digits. In the U.S. Senate race, Ted Stevens easily won re-election with 75.6% of the vote. The only major election in 1980 was for the U.S. Senate, with Mike Gravel seeking his third term to the U.S. Senate. However, the Democrats at the national level, including Jimmy Carter, sought to put more land in Alaska under federal control to protect these lands from development. President Carter went even further to use the Antiquities Act to declare 56 million acres as a national monument without congressional approval. Then there was the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which set aside 1 million acres as national parks. The bill was actually going to be larger, but Gravel and others were able to bring down the amount of land taken by the federal government. In the end, Gravel voted for the bill, though he said that he was unhappy with the bill. As for Alaska Democrats, they saw this as a surrender by Gravel to the federal government. With this, he drew primary opposition from Clark Gruening, a former member of the Alaska House of Representatives and grandson of the senator that Gravel had beaten in 1968. Gravel would only get 43.5% of the primary vote, with Gruening advancing to the general election. There, he would lose to Frank Murkowski in the general election. For the next 21 years, the Alaskan congressional delegation would only consist of Ted Stevens and Frank Murkowski in the U.S. Senate, neither of them facing serious opposition, and Don Young in Congress, who I already talked about. All of these men were center-right Republicans. While Young was more of a maverick, Stevens and Murkowski were less so, as their position of 2 out of 100 senators gave them more clout than Young, who was only one of 435 members in the House. So for now, we are going to only focus on state elections until we get to Lisa Murkowski's election in 2002. Another thing that I want to mention at this point is that I haven't talked much about Indigenous voters to this point. Most of the literature that I have found from the 20th century states that they really didn't favor any political party. However, in the 21st century, polling indicates that they have shifted strongly toward the Democrats. I have an academic paper from the 1970s by Gordon Scott Harrison about Alaska Native electoral politics, which I will mention in the description. But other than that, I really don't have much. It would be an interesting topic to research in the future, so if you know of any resources, please let me know in the comments. In the 1982 gubernatorial election, Democrat Bill Sheffield defeated Republican Tom Fink. Sheffield, who was a millionaire and hotel owner from Anchorage, spent $2 million on his campaign, which allowed him to not only advertise throughout the state, but also travel the state as well. Most of his time as governor was spent around projects that he wanted to do and not really listening to the people of Alaska. There were a few corruption allegations against him while he was governor, saying that he favored certain companies for state contracts. This resulted in an impeachment inquiry, which eventually didn't go anywhere. Sheffield was also in constant conflict with legislators, both the Republicans and his own Democrats. In his re-election bid, there were 16 names on the primary ballot. Sheffield only won 17.8% of the primary votes, finishing behind former State House member and Fairbanks resident Steve Cowper, who Sheffield had defeated by only 259 votes in the Democratic primary in 1982. Cowper would go on to win the general election by 4.7%. Cowper made some bold moves while governor. He proposed a state income tax, which was strongly opposed and never happened. He also proposed tapping into the Alaska Permanent Fund to fund education and other budget shortfalls. That failed as well. The main reason for this was that oil prices sank in the late 1980s and Alaska significantly suffered. In 1989, he decided to not run for re-election, making the race wide open in 1990. Now, the 1990 race was quite interesting. On the Democratic side, you had Tony Knowles, a former mayor of Anchorage and restaurant owner, running against incumbent Lieutenant Governor Stephen McAlpine. Knowles easily won the Democratic primary. On the Republican side, State Senator Arlis Sturgalucci, God, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, won the Republican nomination in a close three-way race. But hey, it isn't just me, because her name was so hard to pronounce, she actually had a slogan which said, "Let's just call her governor." While a moderate on economics, she was quite liberal on the abortion issue, which was starting to become more prominent since the rise of the Christian right in the 1980s, something that I talk about in my video about Alabama. Because of this, many conservative Republicans in the party opposed her and looked for a candidate that could beat her in the general election. Many looked to former Governor Wally Hickel. Remember him? He was last governor in 1969 and then became Interior Secretary and then ran a few times afterwards. Yep, he was the guy that they were looking at to run. But since it was too late for him to put his name on the ballot as an independent, because the filing deadline had passed, they asked a minor party, the Alaska Independence Party, if they would remove their nominee, John Lindauer, and replace him with Hickel. Lindauer agreed since his wife was sick, and Hickel became the candidate. Most people didn't believe that he was going to win because he was a third-party candidate that was on a ticket of a separatist party. But with his name recognition and popularity, even decades later, Hickel won the general election with 38.9% of the votes, with Tony Knowles finishing second with 30.9% of the votes. Now, before we continue, we have to talk about the Alaska Independence Party. The party was formed by Joe Vogler in 1973, who opposed the federal government and wanted Alaska to secede from the Union. In his first run for governor, Vogler received 5% of the votes in the election that saw Jay Hammond win his first election. The next election in 1978, Don Wright ran for governor, winning only 1.9% of the votes. This led to Vogler becoming the party's nominee once again, receiving 1.6% of the vote in 1982 and 5.6% of the vote in 1986. As far as ideology, it wasn't much different from the Republicans, with the exception of that whole seceding from the Union thing. It was socially conservative, fiscally conservative, pro-gun, and had a strong libertarian streak. Vogler said in 1991 that if he were to die, he didn't want to be buried in Alaska until it was no longer part of the United States. Vogler disappeared in May of 1993, with his confessed killer coming forward soon afterwards. His body was found over a year later, and he was buried in Dawson, which is in the Yukon Territory in Canada. After the 1990 election, Hickel's lieutenant governor, Jack Coghill, who was also a former Republican, ran as an Alaska independence candidate and lost. Interestingly, Hickel, while elected under the AIP ticket, did not support secession from the Union, even at a time when separatist movements were strong and not far away in Quebec. You can check out my video about the Parti Québécois here. Coghill won 13% of the vote, finishing far behind the eventual winner, Tony Knowles, and Republican Jim Campbell. After that, the party basically became a fringe party, getting less than 2% of the vote in every election for governor except in 2010, when Bush pilot Don Wright scored an impressive 8.8% of the votes. In December of 2025, the party officially disbanded. The 1994 election was close, with Tony Knowles narrowly defeating Republican Jim Campbell by 536 votes. Knowles, who was popular in the state, was attacked in the dying weeks of the campaign, which made the election tight. Campbell insinuated that Knowles was a womanizer like Bill Clinton, with absolutely no evidence to back up that claim. A recount would be conducted in which Campbell's campaign complained about voter fraud. In the end, Knowles was elected governor. The race for governor in 1998, however, had some interesting twists. First of all, Knowles was expected to win, and he did with 51.3% of the vote. But on the Republican side, things got a little weird. John Lindauer, the Alaska independence candidate who was asked to move aside in 1990 to allow Wally Hickel to run, was now running as a Republican. He ran in the Republican primary against State Senator Robert Taylor and Wayne Ross. Lindauer said that he would spend as much money as it would take to win the nomination, eventually spending over $800,000. When the August 25th primary vote came, Lindauer won 41.7% of the vote, with Robin Taylor finishing second with 29.37%. But many didn't know where the $850,000 that Lindauer had came from, as he refused to say. It later became apparent that a lot of that money he was receiving was from consulting fees, though he claimed that he was retired and hardly paying any taxes. The more people knew about Lindauer's finances, the more they didn't trust him. This led to the Alaska Republican Party asking Lindauer to step down as the party's candidate. Lindauer refused and remained as the Republican candidate. It was too late for the party to switch their candidates, but they were able to add Robin Taylor as a write-in candidate and endorsed his candidacy. Taylor finished second behind Knowles with 18.3% of the votes, with John Lindauer third with 17.9% of the votes. But there was another so-called Republican candidate in the general election named Ray Metcalf. I say so-called because in 1986, Metcalf left the Republican Party and started his own political party called the Republican Moderate Party. He started the party because he felt that the Republicans were becoming highly influenced by the religious right. In the 1998 gubernatorial election, Metcalf received 6.2% of the vote, with the party electing a state senator in 2002. The party contested the next gubernatorial election in 2002, but only received 0.7% of the votes. Metcalf would switch to the Democratic Party in 2006, but we will come back to Metcalf later. The 2000 election was uneventful in Alaska, with the only statewide election of importance being another win for Don Young, receiving 69.7% of the vote. But the 2002 election would be the beginning of a shift in Alaska politics. After 22 years in the U.S. Senate, Frank Murkowski decided to run for governor. The Democratic candidate against Murkowski was Fran Ulmer, the lieutenant governor under Tony Knowles. Murkowski easily won the election, receiving 55.9% of the vote, which was 15.2% clear of Ulmer. Now, as Alaska governor, Murkowski appointed his daughter, Lisa Murkowski, to replace him in the U.S. Senate to fill out the rest of his term. In the same year that Murkowski was elected governor, Ted Stevens won another term to the U.S. Senate, winning 78.2% of the vote. Lisa Murkowski would run for the seat for her own full term in 2004, defeating Tony Knowles in a close race, winning by only 3%. In 2006, the political landscape would change yet again. Frank Murkowski was a deeply unpopular governor and was challenged by a few Republicans in the gubernatorial primary. His stiffest competition was from former state senator John Binkley and Wasilla Mayor Sarah Palin. Palin would go on to win the Republican primary with 50.6% of the votes, with Murkowski finishing third with only 19.1% of the vote. In the general election, she would take on former governor Tony Knowles. One of the issues that split the two candidates was regarding the funding of the Gravina Island Bridge, which would have connected the Ketchikan International Airport to the town of Ketchikan, which was only accessible by ferry. The bridge project would eventually be called the Bridge to Nowhere. Contrary to popular belief, Sarah Palin actually supported the bridge while Knowles criticized the project. Palin would continue to support a number of infrastructure projects throughout the state of Alaska, while Knowles opposed them, stating that they were a waste of taxpayers' money. Remember, even though a majority of these projects were funded by the federal government, the state of Alaska still needed to kick in some funds. Essentially, voters liked Palin, saying that she would spend money in their communities, and Palin would go on to defeat Knowles by 7.4%. The reason I'm not talking about this election in great detail is because I already gave a detailed account of this election in this video. Go ahead and check that out to know more about the 2006 gubernatorial election. The 2008 election cycle has to be one of the most interesting cycles in the state's history. First of all, Sarah Palin was picked as John McCain's running mate in the presidential election. Even with Sarah Palin on the ticket, Illinois Senator Barack Obama had the best performance by a Democrat in Alaska since Hubert Humphrey in 1968. While Palin put Alaska in the spotlight, so did another Alaskan, Senator Ted Stevens. Stevens was running for re-election to the U.S. Senate against Mark Begich, popular incumbent mayor of Anchorage and son of former Congressman Nick Begich Sr. During the election, Begich campaigned on a time for change message, saying that Stevens was out of touch with not just Alaskans, but the issues in general. Stevens gained notoriety after he called the internet a series of tubes. But more things happened between his 2002 election and his 2008 campaign. First of all, the Los Angeles Times reported that Stevens was one of the biggest financial benefactors in the U.S. Senate. However, that's probably quite obvious since he was the longest-serving senator at the time, but it went beyond that. Stevens was being investigated, along with Congressman Don Young, in Operation Polar Pen, an investigation into corruption between Alaska's elected officials in Washington and the oil companies. The federal government said that Stevens took illegal gifts from Vecco Corporation, which included remodeling his house for $100,000 more than the remodeling was worth. The federal government charged Stevens with taking illegal gifts, with the case going to trial right before the election. On October 27th, Stevens was found guilty. He continued to claim that he was innocent and was going to appeal the charges. Right before the election, John McCain, Sarah Palin, Mitch McConnell, and a number of other senators told Stevens to drop out of the race. He didn't, but he still lost, but only a little bit over 1%. Chances are the corruption charges are what swung the election over to Begich in the dying days of the campaign, though the polls had been close even before the trial. This was quite unfortunate for Stevens since his convictions were eventually overturned by the U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder in 2009 due to investigators concealing evidence. A little over a year later, Stevens, along with 5 others, died when the bush flight that he was on crashed into the side of a mountain, with a bush flight claiming yet another high-profile politician. The 2010 Senate race was a wild one, with Lisa Murkowski running and winning as a write-in candidate after losing the Republican Party nomination to Joe Miller. The Libertarian Party of Alaska considered making Murkowski their candidate after she lost the primary, but eventually voted against it. This little point will become ironic later, and since I did an entire video about this specific election, I'm just going to mention it in passing here since that video goes into great detail. But the main thing here is that Murkowski won re-election. But the US Senate race wasn't the only race on the ballot in 2010. So was the governor's race. Governor Sean Parnell ran against Ethan Berkowitz, winning 59.1% of the vote. And no, I didn't make a mistake and forget to mention Sarah Palin. After running for vice president, Palin gained more of a national profile and started making appearances for Republican candidates nationwide, as well as starting Sarah PAC. But on top of that, she resigned as governor. There were a number of issues regarding public funds, but also the Troopergate scandal, in which Palin fired Public Safety Commissioner Walt Monaghan because he wouldn't fire Sarah Palin's ex-brother-in-law, who was a state trooper. That's an entirely different story in and of itself, which I'm not going to go into, but regardless of that, Parnell was now the governor. Another thing that was changing was the state legislature, which had been strongly Republican. In 2006, 11 Republicans and 9 Democrats made up the state Senate. However, a caucus of those 11 Republicans and 6 Democrats formed a majority caucus, which gave the Republicans control of the chamber, while Democrats held the chairs of most of the committees. Since then, both the state Senate and House have seen a number of these arrangements, which still exist today. In fact, as of the time of this recording, both the State House and Senate have this type of agreement between the two parties. The 2012 election didn't have much going on. While Don Young easily won with 64% of the vote and entering his 40th year as Alaska's representative, Mitt Romney also won the state in the presidential election. Still, President Obama won 40.8% of the votes, the first time that a Democrat received over 40% of the vote in Alaska since Lyndon Johnson's 1964 landslide victory. In 2014, there were elections for the U.S. Senate, Governor, and House of Representatives. Don Young won re-election by 10% of the votes, but the other races were interesting. First, let's start with the gubernatorial election. The first candidate was wealthy attorney and former Valdez mayor Bill Walker. Walker initially ran as a Republican in the 2010 primary for governor, finishing second behind incumbent governor Sean Parnell. This time he switched over to running as an independent on advice from his friend, former Governor Wally Hickel. Parnell had some problems of his own, such as corruption scandals within the Alaska National Guard, as well as with oil companies, which is a common theme in Alaskan politics. Initially, the Democrats targeted Walker as being a rich, out-of-touch politician that was just looking to advance his career. However, the attacks against Walker weren't working. Polling showed that Walker and Democratic nominee Byron Mallett were splitting the anti-Parnell vote. Walker had approached Mallett and the Alaska Democratic Party to see if the two could join forces, with Walker being an independent candidate, but Mallett dropping out as the Democratic nominee and instead being Walker's running mate. But the Alaska Democratic Party had one stipulation. See, Walker, though running as an independent, was still a member of the Alaska Republican Party. The Democrats said that if Walker dropped his membership from the Republicans, then the deal could be made. Walker did exactly that, and the Democratic Party Central Committee voted 89-2 to support dropping Mallet as the candidate and having him run as Walker's running mate. With the joint ticket, Bill Walker was elected governor with 48.1% of the vote to Parnell's 45.9%. While this was technically an independent win, it was also seen as a win for the Democrats. In the U.S. Senate race, Mark Begich ran against former Alaska Attorney General Dan Sullivan. This was a key seat for both parties for control of the Senate, with over $16 million being spent on the race. This race was also going to be close. But remember, Begich probably won 6 years earlier because Ted Stevens' late October conviction, which was eventually completely canceled. This campaign was a typical campaign, which saw Sullivan winning by slightly over 2% of the vote. Begich didn't concede until 10 days later. In 2020, Sullivan won re-election against independent Al Gross by nearly 13% and is still in the U.S. Senate today, running for his third term in 2026. In 2016, Lisa Murkowski ran for re-election and easily won against 6 candidates. Remember Republican moderate founder Ray Metcalf? He was the Democratic nominee this time and finished fourth with only 11.6% of the vote. Interestingly, the second place candidate was Joe Miller, Murkowski's nemesis from 2010. What's even more interesting is that Miller was running under the Libertarian Party, the same party that considered picking Murkowski in 2010 after Miller beat her in the Republican primary that year. Honestly, partisan loyalty in Alaska is extremely fluid. Murkowski won in 2022 by 7.4% of the vote in the state's first ranked choice vote. In 2018, Governor Bill Walker ran for re-election and decided yet again to run as an independent. But this time the shoe was on the other foot. Former Senator Mark Begich decided to run for the Democrats and was unopposed for the nomination. But Walker's running mate was still Democratic Lieutenant Governor Byron Mallet. Many Democrats had urged Begich to drop out of the race and support Walker, but Begich refused. On October 16th, Mallet resigned after making inappropriate comments to a woman. After the resignation, there was pressure for Walker to drop out of the race, as almost all of his Democratic support had shifted completely over to Begich. On October 21st, just 2.5 weeks before the election, Walker dropped out and endorsed Begich. This did help, as initial polls showed that Begich benefited. But in later polls, the Republican candidate, State Senator Mike Dunleavy, took the lead. He would eventually win by 7%. When Dunleavy ran for re-election, Bill Walker ran yet again as an independent. As a result, neither he nor Democratic nominee Les Gara were close to Dunleavy. Dunleavy won with 50.3% of the vote, but Gara only received 24.2% of the vote in second place, with Walker third with 20.7% of the vote. Don Young continued to serve Alaska in Congress until his death on March 18, 2022. He had served 49 years and 12 days, the 6th longest in the House of Representatives and the 11th longest of any member of both chambers. A special election had to be called according to the Constitution, which was only 2.5 months before the full-term general election. This meant that the primary for the special election was on June 11th, with the general for the special election being on August 16th. That was also the same day as the primary election for that exact same office. Of course, the general election was set for November. There were 48 names on the primary ballot, which included John Coghill, the former lieutenant governor, Santa Claus, I'm not kidding, Emil Nadi, the first candidate that ran against Don Young in 1973 after the death of Nick Begich Sr., but there were only 3 candidates that were considered serious candidates. The first was Nick Begich III, the grandson of Nick Begich Sr., who is actually a Republican unlike his grandfather. The second was Mary Peltola, a moderate Democratic member of the Alaska House of Representatives. The third candidate was former Governor Sarah Palin. This was the first election for Congress that did ranked choice voting in the general and a top four blanket primary, meaning that the top four candidates on the primary ballot, regardless of party, would be on the general election ballot. All three of the candidates mentioned made it to the general, but Mary Peltola finished fourth behind independent Al Gross. While Gross was an independent, he had the support of the Democratic Party and moderate Republicans in previous runs for office. Gross would drop out of the race and endorse Peltola in the general election. In the general election, with Gross now off the ballot, Peltola was ahead of Sarah Palin by 9% and ahead of Begich by nearly 12%. After the write-ins were dropped, which favored Begich, he was still in third place, meaning that his votes would now be transferred. Even though Begich was a Republican, 28.7% of his votes transferred to Peltola, giving her the win with 51.5% of the votes. The same day that Peltola was elected to Congress, the primary for the full term was held. The same three candidates made it to the general election, with Libertarian Chris By taking the fourth place. In the November general election, Peltola had a strong lead after first preference votes were counted at 48.8%. But even with the write-in votes and the Libertarian votes distributed, Peltola still didn't have enough votes. In the final transfer, Peltola only won 11.6% of Nick Begich's votes, but that was still enough to put her ahead of Sarah Palin, winning by nearly 10%. In the 2024 House election, both Begich and Peltola ran again. They won in the primary along with AIP candidate John Wayne Howe and Democrat Eric Hafner. Hafner is an interesting candidate as he was in prison in 2022 and made his announcement from prison by calling into a radio station. The problem was that Hafner hadn't ever even been to Alaska before, and since he was not scheduled for parole until 2036, he could not move to Alaska even if he did win the election. He finished last in the general with only 37% of his votes being transferred to Peltola. But in the end, it was Begich this time who was the winner with 51.2% of the final round votes. In 2026, Begich is running for re-election to the House, while Mary Peltola announced that she will be running for the US Senate against Dan Sullivan. And with that, we have completed this video about the electoral history of Alaska. Yeah, I know I said that these are brief looks into the electoral history, but I'm sure someone will mention some esoteric thing that I didn't mention in this nearly hour-long video. That's the reason why I always say that these videos are going to be brief. But I hope you did enjoy it and you know a little bit more about Alaska's electoral history now than you did before this video. And if you're from Alaska, are there any stories that you would like to share with me? If so, put them down in the comments below. If you want to watch my video about the 2010 US Senate race in Alaska, you can check out that video here, along with my playlist going over the state histories that I have Alaska and Utah so far. Remember, if you want to support the channel, please subscribe and become a Patreon member with the link down below. Have a wonderful day and bye for now.